very vague concept of how to price business loans for the most part. Some of the community bankers I've spoken to either price off of us or another bank, or just use seat-of-the-pants judgments and instincts to price loans. So one of the stories that I like to tell is to the CPA. I'd like to talk about how we price our credits. And I launch into risk-based pricing and tell them what that is. Two examples I use. One is, Mr. CPA, if the bank were to make a loan to a 25-year CPA firm and make another loan to a 2-year-old restaurant, which loan has higher risk associated with it? Well, everybody knows and would guess the 2-year-old restaurant would have higher risk. Now, the next question I ask them after they answer is, well, can you tell me how much higher risk? And of course, no one can do that. If we're left to our own devices, we have to guess. Now, let's just say that a bank's average pricing for risk was 150 basis points, just to use a number in the sake of the discussion with the CPA. That means that if the CPA firm, that I have two choices. One, I charge every borrower 150 basis points to cover my loan losses, or that I decide to price down off the 150 basis points to the CPA and up over the 150 basis points for the restaurant. But how many basis points up or down? And again, if that's left to judgment, it's going to be wrong. It might be in a ballpark, but it is not going to be precise. I'd like to give you another analogy to use on describing risk-based pricing, and it's how an airplane lands on a runway. An airplane is guided down to the runway by two beacons, and one ensures that the airplane does not land to the left of the runway or to the right of the runway. In other words, the wheels touch down on the runway itself. And the other beacon ensures that the wheels touch down at the proper place on the runway, not too far forward of the runway, in other words, maybe in the dirt, or too far down the runway so that there's not enough room to stop. And there's about, I'm told by my aviator friends, about a 300-foot sweet spot in there that most aircraft can land in. There's a tolerance of about 300 feet. And anywhere within that 300 feet is acceptable for the wheels to touch down. Now, that's the way we used to price credit, somewhere within those 300 feet. It's my belief that as we use databases more intelligently, that we'll be able to bring that runway down on a jelly bean, and we won't have this 300 feet tolerance. We'll be able to price credits at some point using risk-based pricing where we exactly know what we have to price for risk. So that helps them understand. Also, it's intelligent, and it's the first time, in my experience, when I use this with CPAs, they never heard that before. Nobody's ever talked to them about that. Real estate is a good example to use here. For example, if we do a 40% loan to value on your building, you're going to get a better rate than if we do a 70% loan on your building. That's pretty straightforward, but for the most part, the way they think we've been pricing for all these years is you borrowed more money, the rate got a little bit lower, but there was no differentiation for things like risk or loan to value. Now, I want to talk to you about 6 essential products or product features that I think the CPA needs to know about. And I'm not that there aren't more, but these seem to be the 6 that will elicit the most interest on your first visit. There's some more that you would like to talk about at a later date for certain. And as I walk you through these 6, I want to remind you of my comments earlier, and that is, it's okay to only talk about 4 of the 6, but you better have notes so you know which 2 you didn't talk about so that you can introduce them at a subsequent visit. The first is, I think you ought to mention the fact that we do 15-year fixed-rate real estate loans. The public still seems to be concerned, to a degree at least, over the high interest rates of over 15 years ago now, and therefore the fixed rate is popular to those types of borrowers. I think it's important that you mention there is a prepayment penalty on the fixed rate loan, but that's a good product to mention. I think you should also mention the fact that we do 30-year amortization on our commercial real estate loans, because I think you'll find that that is different and that a lot of banks don't offer 30-year amortization schedules. Now this will vary a little bit from state to state, but we have what's called capital access programs. In California it's called California CalCap, California Capital Access Program. In Oregon it's called ORCAP. Each state has a different term for it. But if you have a capital access program in your state, you should bring that up and explain in that, when you're discussing that product, what it is, what kinds of companies it would finance that are not bankable normally. And as you do that, as you walk them through that process, you talk to them about how it finances companies that don't have secondary source of repayment. You explain that. If you talk about companies that have higher leverage, companies that are newer, they will begin to start thinking about their client base. Companies have been turned down because they couldn't get an unsecured line of credit due to lack of secondary. They begin to think of real-life examples of who maybe would fit into this program. If there are SIC requirements, if it limits the type of industries that can borrow under your access program, you need to make sure that you mention that in your call. One of the features of a line of credit that I think you should talk about with the CPA. Every bank does lines of credit, equipment financing, etc. Talking about them is not that advantageous, but talking about the fact that we don't require cleanup on a line of credit is very important. If you think about it, if a company is growing and has a line of credit that was put in place before some of the current growth they've experienced, it's very possible that the line of credit is not adequate to meet their current needs. Now, on top of that, if they're asking or being asked to clean up the line of credit for 30 days, sometime in the course of the year, we've compounded the problem. Not only can they not clean up the credit, as a matter of fact, they need more credit. So those types of growing firms often talk to their CPAs. They're always getting current financial information because they have to support that growth. They're trying to document that growth. And I find when I discuss this feature with CPAs that they are very attentive. Another point that I want to make as it relates to products with CPAs is to help them understand the difference between a 504 loan and a 7A loan. Of course, we're talking about SBA loans. They often don't understand that you can get a 90% loan on a 7A SBA package, but they also don't understand the covenants and requirements and conditions that are going to be imposed on that borrower. And here we're talking about, of course, UCC filings on inventory and accounts receivable, perhaps a deed of trust on the personal residence, key man insurance, and often submission of financial information on a quarterly or somewhat periodic basis. And of course, that's expensive or can be expensive to the small business as they are on a continuously having to prepare that information. And then, of course, the real key here is that 4 or 5 years later, when the business needs an unsecured line of credit, the SBA has a UCC filing on accounts receivable and inventory, which is going to make it more difficult, if not impossible, for the small business to borrow money. So I think it's really important to discuss the differences between a 504 loan and a 7A loan. You might even open up your laptop and show them BFO sales, or whatever it might be called in the future, so that you can have a spreadsheet and walk them through the fact that we're relatively indifferent as it relates to product. We can show all the options to the customer and it can be their choice. The last product that I think makes a lot of sense mentioning is the sweep account, the MSA. Now, if you look at a CPA client base, they're fairly representative of the small business population as a whole. They have some firms that are startups, they have some firms that are very mature businesses, they have some firms that are growing, they have some firms that are losing money and declining. Those firms that are what we would call a cash cow, that are in the that are clients of the CPA firm, many of the banks that we compete against do not have a sweep account. Therefore, as you know, this business has to call and move money, typically on a telephone, has to guesstimate when checks are going to clear, when they need to make advancements on their lines of credit. And the sweep account can be a more efficient vehicle for which they can manage their cash. Now, a couple points here. One, the yield on a sweep account might be higher than the interest rate that they're currently earning on the